actually well, let me just go on to a couple more points and then I'd like to stop. But about American Indians, what makes a song healing? Let me just switch gears really quickly because I don't want to take too much more time. American Indians, actually, flute players that I've interviewed talk about how a single note is more healing. And whereas, our value on virtuosity requires all kinds of complication and things like that. Well, that's a very opposite kind of thing. And so we also think context is very important. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with super hyper complicated music, it's just going to have its context. But we're talking about calming kids down or using this to heal people, to heal ourselves. And I remember at a particular time in my life it was difficult listening to Japanese koto music, not even played by a Japanese person, actually. Elizabeth, I forgot her last name just now, in one of the universities here, she had some wonderful recordings and they were just the thing. I put those on and I was calm. And then there are other questions that I have about what makes songs healing and what is healthy singing. I have a friend who's a very well-known anthropologist, Charles Briggs. He's the chair of anthropology, folklore actually, at the University of California, Berkeley, and he does a lot of work with the Warao in Venezuela, the indigenous people who've been pushed along the river, along the Orinoco River, and Charles has done a lot of work with them over the years, and with their music, actually, their polyphony. But he felt, they live on these wooden scaffolds, so because of the water, they rot. And his foot went through one of those one time, and he had an infection on that foot. So he had a lot of work to do. He had a day coming up when he was going to have to walk all day. So he went to see the shaman, and the shaman sang a song for him, sang to him, sang for him. And he said, okay, you can go now. And Charles walked around all day, his infection went away. And in Charles's perspective, it was the shaman commanded that infection to go away. And so we know so little also about, what does intent do? How do we, getting back to this idea of wishing and these sorts of capabilities that we have as humans that we haven't explored. I think music has the potential for being a much richer, source of health than we have at present, and it's just wonderful to see this kind of energy going towards finding out more about how these things work, although many of them are quite mysterious, and that's also a nice thing. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to see if anyone had questions for Professor Romero in terms of anything that she's... I certainly appreciate the performative versus the participatory as just a general way of looking at the world and thinking about, I live in the world of public school music teaching and what that means in terms of bridging some of the gaps. So I think kind of really, I know that's a huge point right now in music teacher education, kind of thinking about that piece in terms of the transformative power of music education and how we might build some more bridges. What's going on, wonderful things that are going on in the community, and we tend to have walls set up at times. Would you like to add anything? Given your research interest, I think this is right for so.
Sure. I would like to just highlight a little bit of what I do in terms of my research and how that dovetails with the conversation we've been having since yesterday. I conduct research in South Africa with a choral group of whose members are all HIV positive, and they're located in a mission hospital, precisely McCall Hospital in Dublin. But which was a group that started off initially as a support group in 1997 at a time when the antiretroviral medication, the dissemination was very slow. It wasn't yet very widely distributed, so you can imagine at a time on a continent where going to a hospital, being HIV positive or even developing to full-blown AIDS, you go to a hospital, there's not much medical help that doctors could provide. And people will be diagnosed and simply sent home, and some will stay at home until they die, and because they are abandoned, there's also the issue of stigma. Families will abandon individuals. It's kind of they become double victims of the same disease by virtue of being stigmatized because of the infection. So at some point, the hospital, being a mission hospital, that has this idea of, if you think about salvation, one of the things that missionaries have done in Africa during the missionary era, especially the colonial time, was many of the religious organizations thought about the concept of salvation became something that was kind of beyond that of the spiritual salvation of the individual, but also included the physical salvation of the individual, so that healthcare and health assets became an integral component of the missionary projects. So, and some of that philosophy has carried on in some of these health assets that we have on the continent, especially, including at McCord Hospital. So the idea came up that, we gotta do something beyond just thinking about or waiting for when there will be a breakthrough, a big breakthrough medically. So, but if we introduce something that people could value at a social level, maybe a network of relationships between these individuals could provide some kind of support that will eventually extend to becoming a kind of relief from the stress and the burdens of being HIV positive. And that was part of how the September Choir, which is a group I work with, was formed at the hospital. So it started off as a support group, so it became a kind of network. But one of the problems that many of the members of the choir were experiencing that before they became part of the group was, if you're sick and you were employed, for those who were employed, and people knew that you were employed, you could lose your job. So people lost their jobs, and by losing their jobs, they lost income. Therefore, their nutritional habits, became decadent, and they became exposed to opportunistic infections such as tuberculosis or meningitis or any of those things, and they were dying out very quickly. So the support group became a center for praying, for doing all sorts of things. And then the hospital thought, we can introduce also some kind of skill acquisition for these people so they can generate some income for themselves. But now this is where music comes in, because there's this thing that happens with Africans, and for those who are familiar with the story of the slave music that developed in the United States here, especially in the southern United States, what we call the field holders. When people are working in the farms, in the plantations, they sing. Sometimes the music is used to accentuate the rhythm of work in order to make it less burdensome. But at the same time, and this is what is obtainable even in the African context today, where people sing and perform music as something that you use to accompany work. And it was in the context of praying and working and singing that this group became conscious of themselves as people who had the capacity to sing, and they decided to, and it was at that point of gaining that consciousness that the group transformed into a tri-functional entity, what I call tri-functional entity, because it continued to work as a spiritual counseling support group, but then it became also a center for space for skill acquisition, as well as a space for music making. And what that has done for them is they began to interpret it and bring it into a conversation, into a discourse of what the Zulu call Okigbo, which is the sense of well-being. But it's not just well-being in the ordinary sense of it. If you think about Okigbo will be a concept that fits into an indigenous philosophy of Ubuntu, which they say, Umuntu, Ungumuntu, Ungabantu. A person is a person because of other persons. In other words, your existence is only meaningful when it is lived in relationship to the rest of members of community. So, but at the same time, that does not therefore neutralize and negate the existence of the individual. The individual exists. You have your own existence, but that your existence has meaning in relation to other members of the community. So that when music enters into the midst of that very conversation of Okigbo, then the question became and how they reinterpreted the conversation is how does this music then help us to realize that sense of well-being? And one of the things I discovered in studying with and working with this group is how that achievement, that realization appeared at 3 levels. One is that of use of music as a form of exercise, which is very interesting when we talk about, people talk about positive living for those who have HIV/AIDS. And positive living or living positively is all about having a positive physical, emotional, and spiritual attitude towards and about your sense of being infected by this disease, instead of falling into depression and thinking about yourself as somebody who is coffin bound. But you could have a positive attitude, and that positive attitude could then become a means of sustaining your life physically, emotionally, and even spiritually. And one of the ways that you do that when it comes to the physical level is to engage in some kind of dance that becomes a type of exercise that helps to sustain them physically. But then in the context of music making as a community, as a group, as a choir, that also participated at the level of that sense of Ubuntu. A person is a person because of other persons. Then you start thinking about collective well-being, so that the music becomes a sonic realization of, or interpretation or translation of that sense of community, where each individual becomes supportive of one another. It's very interesting how the choir members think about their singing together. Then, whether we're thinking about it in terms of harmony, in terms of cross-reading when we talk about music in the African context, or overlapping call response techniques that are employed in African music. But all of these ways of making music became for the choir members only but a sonic level of a realization of that sense of working together, being together, and being supportive of one another. So, and then at the same time, being together and supportive of one another, both in music making as well as in supporting one another, so that what we do together as a choir can have a final product that will eventually also result in economic well-being. So then you're looking at music making, then having helping them to realize that their sense of Okigbo, that sense of well-being, at 3 levels: that of physical well-being, that of economic well-being, as well as that of emotional well-being as members of a community who participate, who live in a society. Especially think about them, when you think about them as people who have become double victims of the disease by virtue of being stigmatized, being abandoned by friends, being abandoned by families. Now the choir becomes, the space of music making becomes a new family space, a new social space also, where they can socialize in order to strengthen themselves emotionally and spiritually. Well, just to tie it into some of the conversations we've been having here, and I was, especially at the level of physical well-being, I was thinking when Professor Morelli was presenting, I was talking about pulmonary, when we were doing the exercises, and by the time we were done, some of us were already experienced. If you have to do all those doubling of, so, and this is music being performed, but at the same time, notice how it is helping or becoming a means of helping the individual who is participating in that music, even as we're doing it as a group. So it's helping to form a community, but at the same time, at the individual level, it's also, it has just impact at the physical, at the physiological level of helping us to gain some kind of health. What I'm thinking about here, and the way I've tried to interpret this in my own work, is looking away from beyond. I have consciousness and awareness of all this whole area of, just like Brenda was saying a moment ago, Charles Briggs' experience, that music can have that impact, have that spiritual effect of bringing a balance in the disruption of our physiological order. But can we also think about healing beyond that of physiological imbalance and restoring balance in a physiological imbalance that has been, or balance that has been disrupted by disease, but thinking about health as well-being in terms of our physical well-being, in terms of our economic well-being, in terms of our emotional well-being as members of a society. And that's the way I personally thought about it.
It's helpful, and I appreciate the three, that's helpful. A little go framework thinking. Any questions for us? Yes, is that it? Yeah, that's a hand.
We talked at some length about this communal aspect of singing as well. But I want to ask this question, and I say this as a big fan of Native American flute and shakuhachi and all that. I wonder if we don't abstract, partly because we have the ability to listen to recorded music, if we don't abstract from community particular strands of individual expression, which we can then play through our stereo headphones or whatever, and kind of forget the total picture of music in that environment. So it is perfectly possible, and let's take with the Negro spiritual, for example, it's perfectly possible to think that listening to Jesse Norman sing "There is a Balm in Gilead" is a totally transformative healing experience, which it is. But that particular spiritual exists in the context of all Negro spiritual and all collective expression, and it only makes sense in terms of the group creation process, which has enabled that particular expression. That's all I want to say. I think everybody does both. That's what I want to say. I suspect that every group does both.
I'm glad you raised that point. And remember yesterday, Professor Swain talked about in his presentation, gave us example of the old man who was suffering from Alzheimer's and and then people play recording to think he could respond to it and maybe get restored. If there is any downturn to the invention of the mass mediation of music, beginning with the phonogram, that's what it has done, because what it did was it took music, it created the possibility of taking music out of its context. But one thing I also have personally tried to point out to people, again, is not just the technology, there's also an element of the Enlightenment philosophy that has characterized, that has dominated our approach to the study of music in the academy, that has also contributed to this way of thinking about music as something, as an objectified sound that we can, especially thinking about absolute music, right? Something that we can extract from its context and begin to analyze it as a sonic phenomenon, rather than thinking about music as a cultural process, something that is realized in a particular specific cultural context through the process. Yeah, so you're very right, and hopefully with all this kind of research and interdisciplinary approach, even thinking about what she just what's her name again? Liley, yeah. The kind of thing that Liley is talking about here, and humanizing, humanistic approach to music education. My hope is that at some point we'll begin to rethink our understanding of music as just a sonic phenomenon and begin to embrace it more and more, especially the way some of us have come to learn about it in the field of ethnomusicology as a social cultural process.
Give our other panel members a chance to weigh in. If you had questions or additional points you wanted to make, or I'll just add to this conversation.
Just really quickly, I was also musing about the relationship of the individual to the collective in the course of both Professor Romero and Okigbo's comments, and realizing that, at least in my experiences, both are always at play. There's always the experience of the one in relationship to the community, and in my particular fieldwork with this American Kathak community and in North Indian musical and dance discourse in general, the individual is what's privileged in talking about practice and talking about musical experience, in part because it's a soloistic tradition, or a tradition in which there are very few musicians interacting or dancers interacting with one another. And that the experience and practice is always talked about as this solitary, lone type of thing. But if you remember from the video that I have, most practice in this context is taking place in a group. And there's a book called Keeping Together in Time, and I don't remember the name of the author, that talks about the kinesthetic power of movement in a collective, and how important historically, just like the practice of marching, for example, how important that was socially as a physical kinesthetic collective experience that makes me want to articulate that role of the individual within community more, even though it's not discussed explicitly by those that I work with.
I just wanted to quickly just say something on that line. I can use this. Probably can't hear us.
Just since you also mentioned the spiritual and its context, I want to point out that the Center for the American West here did a study along the Front Range and found that over 50% of people who live here are no longer practitioners of church practice. They don't go to church. They consider themselves agnostics or atheists. So that means that a lot of the context for this communal kind of singing is going away for a lot of people who don't go to church. It's one of the last places where people sing together, right? So I think that means that our job as music educators is even probably more crucial for children who are developing, and they certainly should be encouraged to participate.
I just want to underline when you took the example of Satemias, that it is always not only music, it's the whole community which has the effect that music can heal. It's not only music, it's also by the Temiers, when you consider the Temiers, the leaf ornaments that they assemble in a common room, that they sing together, that the whole village is gathering in one room, and finds it very important that one of its members is suffering, and so music could be the clue between these members, and which I tried to show. And it was also you talked about the Zulus, and the Temias have a similar definition of the individual, that through the 4 different souls they are interwoven to each other, they are interconnected. And I think when I consider the whole conference, that maybe it would be good to not only consider music, but bring all these talks together and have a holistic understanding of a suffering and of the healing process.
I'd like to add something. During my study of medicine, they try to make us aware as students that thing that the Professor Ruccius, and sorry, just pointed it out. They try to get another approach to the patient. They try to, through biopsychosocial model, to evaluate his other illnesses in a point of view that was more holistic. So they are not going to ask you, what is your headache? Or where it comes from. No, they are going to ask you, what else? What else? Okay, why are you coming here? I'm getting a headache. What else? No, I'm not feeling so well. What else? No, turns out my child is on drugs. So there is another holistic and interdisciplinary field that plays an important role not only in music, not only in arts, but in the whole multidimensional field of the human approaches. So I think that's very important to take in account in our classroom, in our lives, in medicine, in math, in everything, because we are human.
So I just wanted to add to that in terms of the connection between both of your points in terms of this idea of integration and sort of thinking about being sort of systemically, in terms of what we talk about in classrooms. We often think like that funny but sad YouTube video that you showed us in terms of the pressure points for teachers, and in particular that was an example of an applied lesson, sort of a one-on-one, but that we've got all that kind of content knowledge, that fingertip knowledge, and I'll demonstrate vis-a-vis violin, because I'm a violinist, but that there's that sort of general pedagogy knowledge, but it's where they come together, the pedagogical and the content knowledge, that's really a very unique way of knowing that comes to us from Lee Schulman, who's done a lot of work on that. There's been some development on that in terms of this concept of pedagogical content knowledge, which I think is really rich in trying to understand what is it that's, for us, what is it that's unique about being a teacher, but then we ask that next level question, what is it unique about being an arts teacher? That I think there's some different answers to that question given the very unique and special thing for us that has to do with music and sound, or the very unique and special thing that has to do with the materials in the visual arts setting or in a theater setting. So just wanted to add that in. I wanted to open up to, yeah.
I wanted to throw a piece out on the healing. Your body is made mostly of water. And water is a broadcast antenna. Literally everything the waters of your body hear, you rebroadcast. If you take water and succuss it, you're taking a breath, you're succussing it. You walk, you're succussing it. You move an arm, you're succussing it. If you do any of those things, and there is electrodermal skin response, or a chemielectrical system, if there's enough charge on the body system combined with that succussion of the water templates, takes on the memory. If the charge is too high, electrical current won't run through it. It resists it. The opportunity of music is to break up that overcharge and to allow it to redirect, to reflow. And so that the reconnection can be made, or the template can be remade in a new way, for what it's worth.
No, that's helpful because the thing that's really challenging, I think, about this work is that it's interdisciplinary, and so it's exciting, but it's also, I think that's one of the wonderful things about having a conference like that. Would you agree with me that we're looking at things, philosophically, we're looking at things from the medical, biologically, neurobiology. Thank you for that addition. I think that's really helpful. I wanted to open it up to all of you. It feels like there's a lot of us talking here, and you are certainly part of this conference. So are there questions or points or helpful ideas that would be good for all of us to share as the conference is coming to its conclusion? Yes.
Hi, I work primarily with very holistic approach to people with sound and with other things too. It depends what's necessary, why the person's coming in and whether they're aware of something or not. But I haven't heard anybody talk about the situation where a person really doesn't process very evenly. It's like it's like, nobody has said much about that. There's a dysfunction in how they bring in the sound because they don't hear all the different frequencies. Or they hear it differently in one ear than they do in another, or they hear it differently in bone or air, and they hear it 4 different ways. And then they have to spend a lot of time putting that together. And I find they may have been in music class for some time, or they may have been with an OT working with physical kinds of things, but they still haven't brought it together. And so this bringing it together is a lot of what we're working with in the brain, the way that this particular sound works, but it isn't the same for everybody. It's different for everybody. Because one person may have a curve like this, another may have a curve like this, another may have one like this, one like that. These are just very big, gross generalizations. They can have all kinds of weird patterns. And so the challenge is to get them back into what's a more idealistic. When that happens, many things change within the person so that they then can receive this information that's coming to them through many different types of information, whether it's sound or it's movement or what. And so I don't know if there's any conversation about this in general, that any of you are involved with regard to music and health and holistic growth, personal development. Curious.
I know that one student asked me, how do people hear music when they are deaf? And I know probably some of you know something about that, but they don't. We talked about, thank you, we talked about vibration and how, but I really don't understand that. I'm sure some of you understand it better than I do.
Well, the vestibular system is much more strong in terms of how much it stimulates the brain than the auditory part. And there's a crossover at the, one of the parts of the vestibular system, the saccule, actually processes some of the sounds, the lower sounds. So we directly stimulating the ear, not through moving the muscles. You don't have to move anything to do this. You can have a person in a wheelchair or whatever, and you're still going to find the muscles are going to respond to this. The muscle relaxation is going to be very, very deep, the deep muscles. So there's a lot of things that can happen. But the way that, what is her name?
Glennie.
Glennie. Don and I talked about her, and I haven't seen her in person, but her work with the acoustics through her feet and through a table that she stands on to listen to the music, and then she learns it, and she does it better than anybody else in the world, supposedly. So the vestibular processing is really, you don't want to ever give up your vestibular system. If you had to pick between vestibular, auditory, visual, which one you would keep, by all means keep your vestibular, because if you don't, you're like this, you can do nothing. You have no movement.
I can just add at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, they have a music research center, so I know that they have some dedicated projects, and there's some work in particular Don Hodges has been doing with some scientists, I believe, at the University of North Carolina. So that, I think, is a great resource page in terms of some research that's been doing where, in particular, he's part of a team that's primarily physicians, but he'll weigh in on the music educator piece and the brain physiology, and that's what we're trying to bring that to.
He's interested in all kinds of things.
The transpersonal psychology people do something where they play a lot of music really loud for you. And I had a session once where the music changed. It was Balinese gabon, and it was all kinds of music from all over the world. It was all very intense and very engaging. And I don't know if that would work with, over a course of an hour or 2 hours that they're listening to this intensely, if that would address all these different parameters that you mentioned of, people's lacking. But I know that there were a lot of emotions that surfaced when I did that session, but I don't know, it was very under-researched probably.
I remember I used to do this power sound workshop with Don Campbell, and he would sometimes include the term Tito dance and loud. And so but it was It wasn't an hour, it was long, but it wasn't that long, I don't think. But, and there were a lot of emotions in that.
I wanted to comment on the participatory aspect that you were talking about. I teach the Music Together program here in Boulder, and I presented yesterday, but some of you weren't here. But one of the things that I do is that I bring parents and really young children, babies, through preschoolers together through singing and movement and instrument play, and we really do create a little semi-village, taking it out, of the, isolated musical experience that we were talking about, into more participatory, more community-based, because we really are missing that element. And I think part of the, as far as what you were talking about, Lily, about the issues, the emotional issues for children in education, I think it's important to include the parents and to educate the parents as to how to support their children. And I'm teaching really young children, so we're not doing anything formal per se, but I think if parents and children learn the joy of music and the love of music and more the emotional engagement, that I think that creates more lifelong music lovers rather than imposing. I think oftentimes parents do want to impose that formal aspect really early, and they don't really understand that sometimes children aren't ready for that. So I think that's important too.
I would like to add at Ibagué, Colombia. Ibagué is like another capital of a department there. It's called Tolima. Ibagué is supposedly the musical capital of Colombia. Yet Bogota is more known for their musical activity than Ibagué. Actually, at this time, I'm running a project, a research about developing flash mobs. Do you know what a flash mob is, right? Okay. Because in Ibagué, they don't know what it is. So, in Ibagué, the problem is inclusion. The problem is participation of the community. So, we have a capital which deal with being the musical capital of Colombia, but the people of the community isn't aware of what are they doing in music approaches. So the flash mob is an idea when we are going to, actually this year at November, we are going to do it from the conservatory, the students from the conservatory and myself as a conductor. We are going to go to malls, to buses, to Eric, help me with this. Plazas de mercado.
Market.
Market?
Marketplace.
Yeah, when you get and buy vegetables and fruits, but that is very messy there. So people from the common people, they have not the opportunity to know what is taught in Ibagué, because they have now the resources or the time. So through flash mobs, we're planning to include that community, to being participating in the capital of music in Ibagué through many popular songs from Colombia and popular songs from classical music, such as Fifth of Beethoven, such as Zauberflöte of Mozart, and many other songs that we are for sure that they know, and other Colombian songs. So you're perfectly right. Community needs to be included in that educational processes and educational formation and formation of the students, because only through that we are assuring us an assessment and learning about how to teach for a future.
There is a problem that people in our society don't value emotion. We don't value emotions as much as we do. Well, I guess we used to think, right, that the mind was separate from everything else. We try not to think that, but we're still stuck with the stigmas. So I think we also have to advocate more broadly for the importance of music. You know, even as professors of music, we earn less than any other professors on campus. And if you compare us with the scientists, it's quite a huge difference. So I think there is that also, that we have to constantly advocate for the importance of music, because the society still is not quite ready to see the value as I believe it should be, at least.
I wanted to raise a question. I'm hearing a discussion of the children in education, but I'm hearing that on the sort of the westernized side of things, or as opposed to, what came to mind was in Mr. Ruccius's talk, I assume the children were involved in the community ritual too, right? And I think maybe that's something that we're so into boxes in the West, right? And we've all been talking about holistic and looking at the whole thing. Clearly, just having the kids there and not sending them out of the room, which we regularly do, right, is something that it's so obvious that we probably are afraid to do it in a lot of modern contexts.
As a center of the whole community gathers together in this room, and it's totally normal that the kids are there.
And a normal
yes.
a normal Western reaction would be, "Oh my goodness, old dear Mrs. So and so just died. Don't speak in front of the children." Which is, why cushion them from the realities of life? I guess that's my message. We so pamper the children as to essentially, and we're talking about chemical deformations in development. But here's a case where specific behavioral actions may have very large consequences.
As when I was doing my master's in music education, I remember coming out, reading a lot of Howard Gardner, and particularly his writing on multiple intelligences, and included in that what is the musical intelligence. And the interesting thing about Howard Gardner's theory is that every human being has the capacity and should develop all these multiple intelligences, whether it is the mathematical, the kinetic, and the musical intelligence. One of the questions I always asked myself, and I never had the opportunity to get an answer to it at the time as a student in music education. But at this point, when as an ethnomusicologist now, looking at and start trying to understand music as a social-cultural process, and I keep wondering whether what has happened with especially when I talk about the influence and the predominance of Enlightenment, or sustenance of Enlightenment philosophy, philosophical idealism in the way we study music as an objectified sonic phenomenon. If it is not part of the problem in the academy, in the sense that we no longer think about music as something that children that we should perform, do it in community. Everybody goes with it, just like it becomes part of the acculturation, the enculturation process, rather than a skill that should be acquired in an academic formal setting. Because once we lose that sight of learning, acquiring musical skill, developing our musical intelligence as a part of our enculturation, then there is a problem, because that's where you now run into a problem at some point where you meet some people and say, let's sing together. He says, I don't sing.
I don't sing.
I want to throw one more thing out that's hitting me as you all are talking. When you sing, when you make sound, a lot of us that are classically trained, you're putting it up in the palate, you want it in the facial bones, you're using your back as a resonating plate. You've got big nerve plexus along the front of the body, along the midline of the body. And one of the things I learned over the years, because I sang in New York a bunch of years ago, was that if you sing from each one of those nerve plexes and you're trying to answer a question and you're trying to understand what the music is saying, and you sing it from each one of those different nerve plexes, you get different answers. And so one of the things that you may want to consider within the music education context is to teach people to answer the questions that they have about life and about how they be in the world, using the sound, incorporating the body motion in those nerve plexes, and changing it, and getting the full range of answers that they need, rather than just a single one.
Well, any final comments? Tom, you go ahead.
I feel we are becoming the remnants, the last few minutes. Billy?
I just want to say, this is, I think the third one of these things I have been to, and every one I've come to has been like a PhD education over a weekend or something, because there's such a variety and such high caliber of people that are contributing, and I appreciate what you're doing. I really enjoyed coming.
And thank you all. And I feel like you're all my friends. Again, thank you for coming. Safe travel for those of you who are leaving immediately. We still have a couple of lunches back there if anybody wants some food for the road. And if you want to hear continue our discuss again, Professor Ruccius will be speaking on Monday at 1 p.m., correct? And to everyone else, all of you who are participating, you all have, even just by listening. And of course, to my incredible assistant, everybody. Please, and another comment or question?
That talk will be in C199.
C199 in the music building.
Just a